Although the primary job of any legislature, like Missouri's General Assembly, is to make laws, that is certainly not all that they do or have done. Prior to the adoption of the 17th Amendment and direct election of United States senators, the General Assembly was responsible for selecting Missouri's senators. Because some recent candidates for office have suggested returning this job to the legislature, I thought it might be worthwhile to take a look back at the 1905 selection of Missouri's U.S. Senator. As the fateful hour for adjournment drew near, still no senator had been chosen. Down the aisle trooped a deputation of Republicans carrying a ladder. Their target was the clock, which, as long as it kept ticking, told the assembled legislators that time was running out. Halfway to the clock, they were challenged by a contingent of Democrats. Over went desks with books and papers flying. Documents were trampled, furniture was wrecked, fists flew, bodies struck the floor, and the ladder was thrown out a window. Suddenly, perhaps with a book on legal propriety, someone made a bullseye on the clock. The glass shattered, but the pendulum, like the fists, kept swinging. On the rostrum, the presiding officer ducked for his life. On came a fusillade of ink bottles, all aimed at that pendulum. Eventually, one bottle struck its mark, and time stopped. The bruised and bleeding lawmakers tended their wounds and settled down to elect Major William Warner to the U.S. Senate, the first Republican in decades. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming today. We're pretty much done with the constitutional and the ideological discussion of Missouri's politics, and we want to move into what most people consider the nuts and bolts of government, the institutional discussion. And so over the next series of lectures, we're going to talk about the legislature. Today, we're going to start with the General Assembly, but we're also going to talk about the executive branch and the judicial branch. And if you think about back to that Political Science 101 class, your American government class, most of the time we spent was on the institutions. And so that's the part of the class that we're moving to today. But before we get started, as always, do we have any questions about what we talked about last time? Richard? No, I'm sorry. These actually aren't new glasses. These are my old glasses. I sat on them. It's kind of embarrassing, but I sat on my other glasses, so while those are getting fixed, I had to go back to my old glasses. So if I miss your asking questions or something, just let me know. Besides the glasses question. Okay. And if you didn't notice, we have a new camera crew today. We have Drew Mittman with us today. Our regular camera crew, Andy and Evan, are actually at the Sundance Film Festival. They have a documentary that's under consideration at the Sundance Film Festival, so I know, like me, you wish them very well. But let's talk about the institutions, and today talk about the General Assembly, talking about the legislative process, mainly just the overview of the legislature itself. Now, in Missouri, the legislature is referred to as the General Assembly. So mainly what I want to talk about is the differences between the Missouri House and the Missouri Senate. And as we talked about with the Constitution, the best way for you to learn this material is to learn across. You know, we spent a lot of time on that with the Constitution, with the 6 parts of the Constitution, and going across to the U.S. and then talking about Missouri. You should learn this material the same way. Instead of memorizing down and then coming across and going down, you should try and learn at least this opening material across. So right away, Missouri's General Assembly is divided into a House and a Senate. That means the Missouri General Assembly is bicameral. It has 2 houses. Now, does anybody know which legislature in the United States is unicameral, only 1 house? Paul? No? Nebraska. Nebraska is a unicameral legislature. No House and Senate, just 1 legislature. So Missouri is, just like the United States, divided into the House and the Senate. And I want to start with talking about elections in the House and the Senate. And then I want to talk about leadership in the House and the Senate. And then I want to talk about the makeup of the House and the Senate, how the House and the Senate actually look in terms of demographic information. So let's just start with the simple stuff. The House is an election every 2 years. So that makes it look just like the United States House. On the Senate side, the election is every 4 years. Now, this is a classic trick question because the Missouri Senate is elected every 4 years and the United States Senate is elected every 6 years. And so ordinarily this question is asked, how many years does a Missouri senator serve? And the first choice is A, 6. And you always jump to it because that's what you learn about the U.S. So it's important to remember 2 years for the House and 4 years for the Senate. But like the U.S. Senate, the Missouri the Missouri Senate terms are staggered. So in the House, every 2 years, everybody is up for re-election. In the Senate, it's staggered half and half. So the even number districts are elected this time and the odd number districts are elected next time, so that you don't have everybody in the Senate overturned at the same time. So 2 years and 4 years, that's basic information. The second thing that you need to remember is how old do you have to be? The qualifications for being a member of the House is 24 years. On the Senate side, it's 30. So that, again, makes it very similar to the United States, a different age. And as we talked about in your American government class, age brings maturity, age brings wisdom, age brings more taxes. You have more responsibility with respect to your role in government. So it's a very simple, again, remember across 24 and 30. But I want to stop just for a second on the Missouri House side because there's a very interesting court case, Stiles versus Blunt in 1990. And I want you to think about this for just a second, because the issue in Stiles versus Blunt was the age requirement in the Missouri Constitution for serving in the House. Mr. Stiles argued that he was, in fact, 24 years old if you calculated his age based on the date of his conception. Joni, I know people laugh, but I want you to think about this issue a little bit more. This is not necessarily a hot cup of coffee in your lap at McDonald's. What's at the heart of this lawsuit? If you think about Missouri politics, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, think about Missouri's recent history. What's the issue here? Why would someone sue the Secretary of State for denying access to the ballot? Age based on birth versus age based on date of conception. Is it just some smart guy wants to get on the ballot? Well, if you think about it, what's one of the most important social issues in Missouri in the last 20 years? John? Abortion. And how has Missouri responded to abortion decisions by the United States Supreme Court? If you think about Missouri, as we talked about before, Missouri is a conservative state. When does life begin? In Missouri, life begins at conception, and that was at the heart of Stiles versus Blunt. Not necessarily a frivolous lawsuit, but a lawsuit designed to make a point, and that point was life begins at conception. Now, that case went to the Eighth Circuit of the United States. United States Eighth Circuit Court ruled against Mr. Stiles. And the court argued that running for office is not a fundamental right. Voting is a fundamental right, but running for office is not a fundamental right. And further, that the age requirement does not create a suspect class, and probably most importantly, was rationally related to the state's interest in having qualified representatives. So Mr. Stiles sues to get on the ballot, and the Eighth Circuit Court of the United States says no, that the age requirement based on birth is reasonable given the state's legitimate interest in qualified representatives. But again, this is an interesting case because of the issue it raises. Not so much the age issue, but the issue of when does life begin, which was the issue raised by Mr. Stiles. So, what do you need to know for a 100 level class? 24 years, and 30 years. It's always important to remember we're talking about a 100 level class. So, election, 2 years, 4 years, age requirement. Let's talk a little bit more. Let me find the eraser. Let's talk about the leadership in these two chambers. Again, trying to go across. Leadership in the House, leadership in the Senate. Again, very similar to the United States. Leadership in the House is the Speaker. And there's a number 2 person in the House of Representatives in Missouri, unlike the United States, the pro tem, the Speaker pro tem. Main leadership is the Speaker and can designate leadership power to the pro tem. On the Senate side, there's a bit of constitutional tension. If you think about the United States government, who's the presiding officer, what role, and so on, and it's a question about the role of the lieutenant governor. And what you need to know is there's the tension between Article 4, Section 9, which gives the lieutenant governor ex officio authority in the Senate. Well, ex officio doesn't mean doesn't have presiding powers. Ex officio also doesn't mean has presiding powers. And ultimately, this is going to be resolved in the court. The other part of the Constitution that we need to look at is Article 3, Section 18. Again, Article 3 dealing with the legislature. Article 3, Section 18 gives the bodies themselves, the Senate and the House, the power to appoint their own officers and determine the rules of proceedings. So, Article 3, Section 18 allows the House and the Senate to name their officers and determine the rules for their proceedings. Now, one might think that that was clear, but it does not get resolved until 1973. Now, again, we're working on the 1945 Constitution, but this issue, this tension between what does ex officio mean as compared to the officer and rules from Article 3, this is resolved in 1973, State versus Carson. And in 1973, State versus Carson, the Missouri State Supreme Court ruled that the lieutenant governor does not have presiding powers in the Missouri Senate. So what's left for the lieutenant governor, we'll talk about a little bit later, but in terms of the legislature, he gets to vote in a tie. He has no presiding authority. So there's some constitutional tension in terms of the governor. It is not clarified until 1973. So lieutenant governor is not the leader of the Senate. The leader of the Senate, as a result of 1973, is the president pro tem. So if we're going across, the leadership of the House is the Speaker, leadership of the Senate is the president pro tem, not the lieutenant governor. And again, a classic trick question. Which of the following is the leader in the Senate? You might pick lieutenant governor based on your experience with U.S. government, but that confusion is resolved in 1973, so the leader of the Senate is the president pro tem. Okay, questions about leadership? It's the same as the U.S., a little bit different. All right, I want to move ahead and talk about the size of the House and the Senate, and what does it mean to talk about the size of the body? So let me erase just a little bit more. All right, side by side, if you think about the size of the House, 163 members versus the Senate, 34. What does it mean?
Yes, Carol, I know. One is bigger than the other one, but let's go just a little bit deeper. What does it really mean when it comes to comparing those two bodies? The bigger the body, the more likely it is to be heterogeneous. To use a more common term, probably want to talk about diversity. A bigger body, like the House, is more heterogeneous, meaning it has a more diverse membership. The Senate is smaller, and so it's the opposite. It is more homogeneous. It is less diverse. Now, I do mean less diverse in all of your standard demographic areas, but it means lots of different things. We'll talk about that in just a second. But the House, because it is bigger, simply because it is bigger, is more diverse than the Senate. The Senate, simply because it is smaller, is less diverse. Well, what does that mean? What does the average Missouri senator look like? Does the average Missouri senator look like you? Which body is more likely to have someone that looks like you? And the answer is the Missouri House. What I'm going to try and leave you with here today is we think about the differences between the House and the Senate, and we tend to think about them in terms of parties. The Democrats control the House and the Republicans control the Senate, or the other way around. But there are institutional differences just because of the size of the institution that have nothing to do with parties. Let's talk about what this means one step further. Large body means small districts. A large body translates into small or smaller districts. Contrary, a small body means larger districts. All right, let's think about that for just a minute. Missouri's House, the lower chamber in the General Assembly, Missouri's House is one of the largest houses in the United States. One of the largest houses in the United States. The Senate, by contrast, with only 34 members, is one of the smallest Senates in the United States. And this is really important when it comes to representation. How big is a House district? Well, it's not very big. What it means is it's small enough for you to get to know your representative better. The smaller the district, the fewer the constituents that a representative needs to represent. The larger the district, the more constituents they represent. And this is where we turn this a little bit on its head. The House is a more heterogeneous body because it is bigger. But because the districts are smaller, the people that live in those smaller districts are much more likely to be homogeneous. So there's a difference between a heterogeneous body and a homogeneous district. Let me put it in plain English. A small district means that you get to know your representative. And because the district is so small, you are more likely to live within a defined geographic area, and you're more likely to be like each other than unlike each other. So when you send a message to your elected representative, it's a clear, consistent message from a fairly homogeneous body. Now, let's go to the other side. Larger district with a homogeneous body means a more heterogeneous constituency. So a senator represents a larger geographic area, and because it's a larger geographic area, it is more likely that the constituents in that area are more heterogeneous. There are more differences of opinion in a Senate district than there are in a House district. So a senator is in a tougher position because the message that a heterogeneous district or heterogeneous constituents send is less clear than the one that you get from the House. Now, where does this make a difference? I'm going to put an asterisk, and we all know that that doesn't necessarily mean it's more important, but this is what's more interesting. Large Senate districts in the middle of the state are agricultural. And it doesn't really make a difference whether it's a large Senate district or a small House district. The message is the same. As we talked about with respect to Missouri's political ideology and the role of agriculture, where the Senate district size makes a difference is as those districts get closer and closer to major metropolitan areas. So a senator from Springfield might represent Springfield as an urban area as well as parts of Greene County that are agricultural. The same would be true for St. Louis County, especially as you go into West County. You may be representing some western areas of that district, which are smaller towns and more agricultural. And the same is true in Kansas City. The closer you get to the urban areas, as you're in those collar or border districts around St. Louis, around Springfield, and around Kansas City, you're much more likely to have a Senate district that is heterogeneous, where you get much more differences of opinion than if you're a House or Senate district in the middle of the state. All right, does that make sense, Janice? Janice is nodding. Does that make sense to you, Richard? All right, so think about this in terms of the differences between the House and the Senate. A heterogeneous, more diverse body because it has smaller districts, much more likely to be diverse. The Senate, because of larger districts, are much more likely to be the same. And then you turn that on its head when you think about the districts themselves. Small districts means homogeneous constituents. Large districts means heterogeneous constituents. But the only time this really matters is in those border areas. All right, probably have beaten that into the ground. Questions? All right, well, let's talk about this in sort of summation. We tend to focus on the differences between Democrats and Republicans. We tend to focus on the legislature. The House is controlled by Democrats, or the House is controlled by Republicans, and the Democrats control the Senate, or the governor is one party and the legislature is another. We tend to focus on parties, but what I want you to walk away with is the difference between the House and the Senate with respect to its numbers, with respect to the size of the body, with respect to the size of the constituency, means that there are institutional differences between the House and the Senate. The House and the Senate see things differently regardless of party. And if you think about what we saw, I mean, you want to go back, what we saw in 2012 and 2013 and 2014, we saw a legislature that was controlled, both chambers were controlled by the Republicans. Republicans controlled the House and Republicans controlled the Senate, but in 2012, 13, and 14, the legislature didn't effectively pass legislation, even though they were controlled by the same party. And it's because they have institutional differences, they see things differently. And if you take nothing away from this lecture, that's going to be one of the more important things. There are institutional differences that are sometimes more important than partisan differences. Okay, I'm putting a star next to that, sometimes more important. Okay, so that's enough about size. Let's talk about sessions. And this is going to be applying to both the House and the Senate. And it has to do with when and how long the General Assembly meets. So let's get past that. And we'll have a conversation about sessions in the legislature. All right. Basically, I want to talk about three kinds of sessions. The first and most important one, it would be what's called a regular session. Regular sessions in Missouri last for 4.5 months, from January to May. 4.5 months. Now, if you go back to the election of members of the House, a session lasts 2 years. And so in any 2-year period, they're going to meet 4.5 months, January to May, and then 4.5 months again, January to May. So in any given period, 2 years, we're going to meet with 9 out of, no, not 12. It's a 2-year cycle, 9 out of 24. So the Missouri Legislature only meets in regular session for 9 months out of 24 in a 2-year cycle. That means Missouri has a part-time legislature. Part-time legislature. Now, the formal political science term for this is non-professional. I don't like to use non-professional because it sometimes sounds like I'm saying that they're not professionals. And that's not at all what the term means. The term means part-time. If you're in Jefferson City for 9 months out of 24, that means you have a regular job somewhere else. And so being a legislator is your part-time job as opposed to your full-time job. You might be a butcher. You could be a baker. You might be, can you see where this is going, Joni? You might be a candlestick maker down at Silver Dollar City. Okay, I apologize. Part-time legislature. But let's go back to that conversation about districts again. Small districts means the representative is closer to you. Think about 9 months versus 24 months. Where are they most of the time? They're in the district. They have a job. They're your banker. They're an insurance agent. They're a lawyer. They're a farmer. You see your representative when you go to the feed store. You interact with your representatives on a regular basis because it is a part-time legislature. The idea is that you have a greater influence over your legislator because they are part-time. Other states, full-time legislator. I mean, think about the criticism of Washington, D.C. They lose touch with their constituents because they're in Washington all the time. Not so in Missouri. You see your representative getting a haircut. You see them at the feed store. You bump into them at the grocery store because they live in their district. And this is true for both the House and the Senate. This is separate from the issue of size. Because Missouri has a part-time legislature, they are closer to you. Now, another way to look at that is, and I think sometimes it's a cynical way, but there's always a kernel of truth to this. If they're in the district more than they're in Jefferson City, then they're not causing trouble. I mean, we talked about Missouri being a conservative state, believing in smaller government. Well, one way to guarantee smaller government is to keep the legislature from meeting and passing legislation. So the fact that Missouri has a part-time legislature is just one more example of Missouri's political conservatism. So, starting with regular sessions, 4.5 months every year, and that adds up to 9 out of 24. Now, one important difference, or something to think about, I guess, is that there's no carryover from one year to the next. And so if you think about the standard how a bill becomes a law, which we'll talk about next time, you get through all the steps in the process and the legislature adjourns in May. Let's say there's 100 steps in the process and you're at step number 99. Where do you start again in January? You start back at 1. So issues that don't make it through the process, and I'll have something to say about this in just a second, issues and legislation that don't make it through the process in 4.5 months have to start again. So there's no carryover between the first year and the second year. Maybe it's not the most important thing to remember, but it's important to remember. So that's regular sessions. Now, we also will have special sessions. Special sessions separate from the regular sessions. And these are ordinarily called by the governor. We're going to talk about the legislative role of the governor when we talk about the powers of the governor in a couple of lectures. But for now, let's just talk about the governor has the ability to call special sessions of the legislature. And I'd like to suggest 4 different reasons that a governor might do that. And the most obvious example historically in Missouri has been some kind of emergency. The legislature is called into session by the governor to deal with some sort of emergency. And more often than not, that emergency would be a natural disaster. I mean, perhaps before some of your lifetimes, but 1993, flooding in Missouri, where the Missouri River and the Mississippi River went over their banks. It happens on a fairly regular basis, but in 1993 it was catastrophic for the areas around St. Charles and down in Cape Girardeau. The governor called the legislature into special session to deal with policies as a result of that emergency. And if you think about other natural disasters that have occurred in your lifetime, then you can understand a reason why a governor might call a special session. Another reason that governors have called special sessions, and this has probably been more true recently, because they only meet for 4.5 months, sometimes the process is too hurried and mistakes can be made. And so a legislature can be called back into session by the governor to make corrections to legislation that was passed. And the nice thing about doing that is you can ordinarily call the legislature back into special session to fix a problem in a law before it's actually enacted in the following year. So the legislature will be called back into special session to deal with a mistake that was made in legislation that was passed during the regular session. Related to that, time. A governor might call the legislature back into session or call a special session to deal with something that did not get finished during the regular session. And again, think about 4.5 months. How much time is that? It's not a lot of time, especially when you think about how little the legislature does early in the process and how much they try and get done late into the process. You can get closer and closer and closer to adjournment and not get accomplished that one piece of legislation that you could if you had another week. So the legislature, again, more recently has been called into special session by the governor to finish something that they didn't have enough time to finish during the regular session. And again, I think intuitively that makes sense. And you have an alternative. You could extend the session, but then you get back into Missouri being a conservative state and wanting the legislature there, less frequently and so on. The fourth reason, and again, more recent, at least more recent for me, would be politics. The governor wants to make a political point. And it could be to make a political point in general. It could have to do with re-election. But I think we saw both governors Holden and Blunt calling the legislature back into special session to make a political point. It doesn't necessarily have to do with any emergency. It's not to make a correction. It's not because we ran out of time. It's because the governor in question, again, starting probably with Governor Holden, but certainly true for Governor Blunt, the governor wants to make a political point with the legislature, but also probably with a broader audience in the people of Missouri. Sometimes related to re-election, sometimes related to principle. So why would a governor call the legislature into special session? These would be the 4 reasons. Historically, the most important reason that a governor will call a special session would be to deal with some sort of emergency. All right. That would be special sessions. The last kind of session, let me erase so that I stay in the center of the board so Drew doesn't have to follow me all over the place. Veto sessions. When the governor vetoes a piece of legislation, then the legislature can meet in a veto session, and this would be called by the legislature themselves, and it is always in September. So the governor vetoes a bill. The legislature has the opportunity to override that veto by calling a veto session. Now, there's absolutely no requirement that the legislature attempt to override the governor's veto. And if you think about this, why might the legislature do this? Obviously, politics. You might have a Democratic governor, Republican legislature, or you might have a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor. But really what it comes down to in a veto session is votes. How big was the margin of passage when the legislature passed the legislation in the first place? Do you have enough votes to overcome a gubernatorial veto? And so the issue is always resolved in September. So the governor could veto a dozen bills and there'd be no veto session. The governor could veto a dozen bills and there's a veto session to try and overturn 6 of them, or 2 of them, or 1 of them. But it is at the discretion of the legislature. Now, obviously, the leadership plays a role, but the legislature itself calls the veto session, and it's always in September. Yes, Paul, it is more common to find the veto sessions when the legislature is controlled by one party and the governor is of another party. There's no doubt, because odds are the governor is more likely to veto legislation passed by a legislature from the other party. So yes, that is true. All right, so 3 kinds of sessions: regular, which is built into the Constitution; special sessions, which is a power given to the governor; and then veto sessions, which is a power given to the legislature itself. Okay, so we have House versus Senate, terms and all that. And then we have the 3 different kinds of sessions. The last thing that we need to talk about in terms of just the basic nuts and bolts of the legislature is term limits. So the term limits is pretty self-explanatory. Missouri's Constitution has fixed term limits for members of the House and members of the Senate. Adopted in 1992, so this is recent history, adopted in 1992 and added to Article 3, Section 8. And as we talked about before, I am not going to ask you in which article and which section, but it's important to me to remember. Article 3, Section 8 establishes term limits. A member of the House can serve a maximum of 8 years. A member of the Senate can serve a maximum of 8 years. Total, a member of the General Assembly can serve a maximum of 16 years. Now, just to prepare you for variations on a multiple choice exam, you can ask this 2 different ways. How many years can a member of the House serve maximum? How many years can a member... I wrote House twice. How many years can a member of the House serve versus how many years can a member of the Senate serve? The other way to ask it is by terms. So let's do the math. 8 years equals how many terms? Richard? 8 divided by 2, Richard. Okay, 4 terms in the House. What about the Senate? 2 terms in the Senate. So the question could be asked, how many terms are imposed by the term limits, or how many years in the legislative body? It works either way. So I want you to remember it both ways. 8 years in the House, 8 years in the Senate. That means 4 terms in the House or 2 terms in the Senate for a grand total of 16 years. And this gets back to what I said before. In 1992, the citizens of Missouri were concerned about incumbency, people serving too long in the legislature. In many ways, their focus was on Washington, D.C., in that representatives and senators losing touch with their constituents. And at this time period in the late 80s, early to mid 90s, it was a wave that swept across many of the states of the United States, and they adopted term limits on the state legislatures. Missouri took this one step further in 1996. 1996, Missouri adopted term limits for their United States representatives. This has to do with the General Assembly in Jefferson City, but in 1996, the voters of Missouri adopted term limits for members of the United States House and members of the United States Senate. And this would be Article 8, Section 16. U.S. House and U.S. Senate. Missouri adopted term limits. Now, there was a couple of caveats, but I won't go into the details because I don't think in a 100-level class you need to get into the nitty-gritty details. But I do need you to know one important thing. In 1995, the United States Supreme Court, in a case called U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton, U.S. Term Limits, I'm going to run out of space. In 1995, U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton, this is an Arkansas case. Arkansas had adopted term limits for members of the U.S. House and members of the U.S. Senate. In 1995, in U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton, the Supreme Court of the United States said that was unconstitutional, that a state could not impose term limits on its U.S. senators and representatives. That would require a constitutional amendment. So in 1995, the United States Supreme Court says a state can't impose term limits on its members, on U.S. representatives and U.S. senators. What's the problem here? Carol, you're shaking your head. Carol is correct. Missouri voted to impose term limits on members of the U.S. House and U.S. Senate after the United States Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. So there's a little bit of irony in the years. Missouri adopts something in 1996 that was already determined to be unconstitutional in 1995. Well, as we'll talk about later in the semester, nothing is unconstitutional forever. And I think the people who passed term limits in 1996 believe that they had principle on their side, and maybe the United States Supreme Court will come around. I guess we'll have to wait and see. All right, I want to stop here for today. We've got the basics of the legislature, so you have a sense of the differences between the Missouri legislature and the U.S. legislature, but more importantly, I want you to walk away with a little sense of the differences between the Missouri House and the Missouri Senate. And of course, I want you to remember sessions and term limits and so on. Questions? All right, next time, what we're going to talk about is how a bill becomes a law in the state of Missouri. Thank you very much for your time. The end.